Hello, my name is Frank Gaffney. I am thrilled to be presenting another example of the big picture concerning specifically North Asia. Today we're going to be addressing the North Korean-South Korean divide and its prospects for possible reunification and under what circumstances. We'll be talking with one of the country's preeminent experts, my word, not necessarily his, about Korea. He has served there with distinction at the tactical level on up to the strategic level. And he has done so in the uniform of the United States Army, through whose ranks he rose to the distinction of a colonel in our special forces. His name is David Maxwell. I don't know him well, but I'm looking forward to getting to know him better in the course of this program. I've admired his work for a long time, now being performed at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he is a senior fellow. David Maxwell, welcome to The Big Picture. It's great to have you with us.
And thank you for taking the time to look at this very important subject.
It is hard to overstate how important it is, the more so because so few, particularly in the United States at the moment, are taking a look at it. So this is why we really wanted to get you and your expertise brought to bear, and thank you again for doing it. So David, you've certainly spent a lot of time in grade in the theater. How has that informed your insights into the threats we're facing in the theater generally, but specifically from North Korea?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. And I think going back to the 1980s when I first went to Korea, I was stationed on the DMZ. And so we were toe-to-toe with the North Koreans. And back then, the American military patrolled the DMZ. So we actually conducted patrols and day and night, and we're helping to secure the DMZ along with South Korean forces. And so that gave me a real perspective of being able to look the enemy in the eye.
One of our guests said something that is so true, but it's not often noted. The demilitarized zone is the most heavily militarized space on the planet, arguably. And so when you're talking about toe-to-toe, in that window, as I recall, there actually were some physical attacks against Americans,
yes.
Murderous attacks at that by the North Koreans, right?
Well, 1976 was the axe murder.
The axe murder. Okay.
But we've had skirmishes, and there continue to be skirmishes to this day between North and South. Of course, there's no longer U.S. forces stationed there, but that gave me a real sense of the urgency and why the U.S. Command and the Combined Forces Command is committed to be ready to fight tonight.
Right.
The proximity of the North Korean forces, the fourth largest army in the world with 4.2 million soldiers, that are 70% of which are stationed on the DMZ, from the DMZ to Pyongyang. And they are in an offensive posture. They're ready to fight. Now, they're suffering from obsolete equipment, malnutrition, many of the problems North Korea faces. But, as Lenin said, quantity has a quality all its own, and there's a certain great quantity.
But talk about one other piece of the geography, because I think most of us, again, don't appreciate how that bears on what you just said. It's not just that they've got this 2 million plus man army stationed in immediate proximity to the line of departure, if you will, using, I think, the military term. It's that the capital of South Korea is within artillery range from those positions in the north, right? Which means, essentially, a good-to-go posture could mean unshirted hell breaking loose in South Korea at any given moment.
Absolutely, and that is the real challenge, because the ROC U.S. military, the Combined Forces Command, is charged with deterring and defending, and it is charged with defending the capital. And so, geographically, the capital is so far forward and so close to the DMZ that it is truly a really complex military problem to defend that. Now, the good thing is,
it's called an attractive nuisance, I think. It's so tempting, I imagine, especially to folks like the Kim Dynasty.
Although, counterintuitively, it does cause a problem to the North Korean military.
Really? How so?
Because it will be like a black hole. It is an urbanized environment, and once military forces go in there, they're unlikely to come out. But, of course, it will cause tremendous amount of death and destruction because the majority of the South Korean population is there, and they will not be able to evacuate. And so the geography hasn't changed in 1,000 years, but the urbanization, the urban sprawl has. And so that really complicates the problem for North Korea. And their military problem, though, is still the same as it was in 1950. They have to rapidly attack, get across the DMZ, get to the Han River south and east of Seoul, and then get to Pusan before U.S. forces can reinforce. That's the essence of the North Korean campaign plan, and they must rapidly do that.
But a piece of the doctrine that I'm interested in your assessment of, and I know that you've studied this closely, but I also understand that nobody's an expert in this space because it's a question of deep research and trying to divine what is often opaque information. But having said all that, wouldn't you, in their position, lay waste to that urban center with all of, 14,000 artillery tubes in proximity, and maybe use chemical or even biological agents to depopulate the place so that it's not quite the black hole or killing field for the defenders to operate against you?
They will attack it with various means. What I'm talking about is their maneuver forces, their tanks and infantry will want to bypass that. But they will want to fix Seoul, and they will want to terrorize it.
Right.
And they have the capability to do that with their chemical weapons, with the artillery, rockets, and perhaps even biological weapons. So they will attack that to fix it while their maneuver forces bypass to the east. And if they want to win the war, they have to rapidly occupy the entire peninsula before South Korea can mobilize all its reserve forces and before the U.S. can reinforce from Japan and from the United States.
Now, remind us, David, how many U.S. forces are now there? Not at the DMZ, but a little further south.
There are 28,500 troops and most of those troops are dedicated to the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command, the Air Component Command.
Is Republic of Korea.
The Republic of Korea, the Combined Forces Command. They provide the headquarters, intelligence, logistics, and communications.
Right.
And then we have the 2nd Infantry Division, which is not a complete U.S. infantry division, but it is combined with South Korean forces. And then we have 2 fighter wings that are in Kutsan and Osan, which provide a tremendous amount of air power combined with the South Korean Air Force, which is a very formidable force itself. So we have a relatively small amount of forces because South Korea has 650,000 troops.
Combined reserve and active?
Active duty forces. Yeah, they will have about 1 million forces after they completely mobilize. Well, actually, upwards of about 3 million forces when all their reserve their National Guard type forces, and we will contribute about 700,000 American troops if we execute the entire defense plan.
Down.
Yes.
And when you talk about reinforcing, are you talking about that kind of tail coming in, or are you talking basically about those 20,000?
We're talking about the 50,000 troops in Japan, the Marines that are in Japan that make up the bulk of the fighting force there, air power, and then, of course, coming from Hawaii, Alaska, and the mainland of the United States. We have forces that are apportioned or dedicated to contribute to the defense of Korea.
Yeah.
And, of course, we suffer from the law of physics, time and distance. You can't get around those two. Right. And so it takes about a week.
A lot of time and a lot of distance in the Western Pacific.
Exactly, which is why we want to have forward stationed military forces, and not only in the Pacific, but around the world. Because
and in Korea itself, of course.
Korea itself.
We're going to come back to that in a moment. But let me just ask you one bit of context here, David, because I think we've established in the course of this series of programs that there probably wouldn't be a North Korea if there weren't a communist Chinese backup for it. And to the extent that you have studied both from your various vantage points in that region, to what extent does all of this ultimately come down to the Chinese being able and willing to backstop the North as they did in the first Korean War, if God forbid there's a second?
Well, China and North Korea, they're only allies. They have no other allies. So, and the saying goes, they're closer than lips and teeth. Sometimes I think they're more like dentures and rotten gums, but that's their only alliance. I think China, its strategy is really about the 3 no's: no war, no instability and regime collapse, and no nuke. So they're a pretty good baseball team. They're batting 600. Nuclear weapons, though, are not a threat to China. And so they're willing to live with
theirs
that.
In North
Korea's nuclear weapons.
Right.
China does not perceive them as a threat to China.
They helped get them, didn't they?
It certainly did, and at least through AQCon and Pakistan, but their weapons are of Chinese design. So,
right.
But
and with transporter erector launchers from China as well.
Yes, although you have to give a lot of credit to the North Koreans, how they adapted trucks from China. I mean, actually, they duped China. Those tele-erector launchers were actually trucks that China provided, because China has not been providing a lot of conventional large-scale military equipment. But the North is brilliant at re-engineering,
the Chinese line, as I understand it, was those were just logging trucks.
That's right.
Are you saying that is actually what they were, and that the North did the jujitsu to make them into
I think
things
this last one that we've seen, the 22-wheeled one, I think is clearly of North Korean modification. And so,
well, I don't mean to say that they didn't modify them. I'm just saying they weren't tells, as they call them.
Well,
to begin with,
it's difficult to know for sure. China, of course, does say they're logging trucks. My point is, though, whatever they gave them, North Korea is masterful at re-engineering and developing things for their purposes, and that's something we should pay close attention to. How North Korea adapts. Again, it is has a failed economy. It is the population is suffering horrendously, yet they continue to advance their military capabilities, and including, of course, nuclear weapons, and so and intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Well, the reason I was asking about the Chinese doctrine and how that might fit into all of this is, as you know, the Chinese are rather serious, it turns out, about biological warfare. And one of the things that they've not only been working on, evidently with help from us, including financing, but also training, is engineering weapons for the purposes of attacking specific populations. If the North Koreans are taking a page out of the Chinese playbook in the hope of depopulating the South, but not destroying it, I mean, the scenario that I just described to you is going to leave a smoking ruin of the place if the North does move into it in force. Not so much with biological weapons. It's the old line about the neutron bomb. It kills all the people but saves all the buildings. So would BW. And that seems to be something the Chinese are very keen on in terms of their doctrine. Is that so with the North, the best we can tell?
I think we can only make assessments and try to judge that. I've really seen no credible information leading to that, but I think it's not difficult to make that assessment. That I think what's really important to understand about North Korea is there's nothing that restrains them. Biological, chemical weapons conventions,
whatever it takes,
they don't restrain. It doesn't constrain them, and so they will use all means necessary to accomplish their objectives. I mean, from a Clausewitz perspective, their war will go to the extreme lengths, to total war from their perspective, and there is nothing, probably even China, that can really constrain them if that is what they seek to do. And I think that we have to make the assumption that, and I believe this, that North Korea, its major objective is to dominate the peninsula under what I like to call the guerrilla dynasty and gulag state. It's unification on their terms, which is what contributes to survival of the Kim family regime. Not survival of the nation state, not survival of the Korean landmass, not survival of the Korean people in the north, but survival of the Kim family regime, which we like to describe as a mafia-like crime family cult.
Indeed. That brings me to the question of South Korea and the government there. And the traditional view, as I think most of us understand it, is the South likes being free and likes having a successful economy, a democratic form of government, and prosperity, as well as considerable freedoms. And yet, the government of Moon Jae-in seems, I think, even in its own words, to be really quite open to the idea of reunification with the North, even on the North's terms, meaning that South Korea would no longer be South Korea. South Korea would be presumably more like, if not fully integrated into this horrific,
I would have to push back on you there. I would.
Please do,
I would
because
have to push back
that's
on
what
you
I've
there.
been hearing.
I think that is really a mischaracterization. South Korea wants to remain South Korea. They want to remain free.
No, again, I'm talking about the government, not necessarily the people.
But I
Moon
think
Jae-in,
it's important. I think it's important to talk about first the Korean people and what Korea wants. Now, the Moon Jae-in administration, what they have put forth about unification is 2 systems, 1 country. And that there would be two systems that would eventually unify. But there are some within the administration and some within the progressives. They romanticize North Korea. They look at North Korea's Juche ideology as independent, self-reliant. But I know the professionals in the South Korean government, the national security experts, they do not want unification on North's terms. The danger is, and the real danger with the Moon administration is its delusion that Kim Jong-un will ever negotiate in a good faith manner, as a responsible member of the international community. And that what they want to do is to be able to negotiate a path to unification. The problem is North Korea's strategy, Kim Jong-un's strategy, is based on subversion, coercion, extortion, blackmail diplomacy, and ultimately the use of force to unify the peninsula under its control. And so that's where you have the two issues. And of course, Moon Jae-in has a strong desire to be the peace president. And he will leave office next May. Presidential elections are in March. And he wants his legacy as the president that brought peace. And so he is pursuing these objectives to try to cement his legacy as the peace president. And that is where the danger lies. I believe, knowing Korea as well as I do, that the Korean people would never submit to rule by North Korea. You will see the Koreans resist that at all costs in the South. Look,
I hope so. From your lips to God's ears, and you certainly know them better than I. My concern is that you have a regime that, at least in the political sector, not necessarily the professionals and the permanent bureaucracy and so on, but the political leadership, both today's and that may be in prospect. Sure. If that election goes,
and let me just tell you
very badly, it'll be even worse in terms of a willingness to pursue. And if I just may finish this thought, I've heard this idea of 1 country, 2 systems somewhere else.
Sure.
And if you talk to the people of Hong Kong, they had no more enthusiasm for becoming enslaved by the Chinese Communist Party than the people of South Korea do, living under this horror in the North. And yet, sometimes things work out badly when you have people who either blithely play into this idea or are duped into thinking that somehow they won't be forced into it.
Sure. And I think that's an important warning to look at, probably more important for Taiwan as well. But I think that's important. However, the Korea situation is much different. South Korea has the ability to resist in a much greater scale than Hong Kong.
For sure.
So I think that's what's really important. The problem
is once you're into the framework, and that's the thing that worries me, I guess, is that these delusions, as you say, can get you into a compromised position, and suddenly maybe it's just that violent onslaught that gets going from a standing start.
And that's what I'd like to say.
It could go badly.
2 things. The challenge we have in the alliance is the different views of North Korea, the strategic assumptions South Korea and the United States make about North Korea. And many people, both in
South Korea or the South Korean government?
The South Korean government make about North Korea. And they believe that North Korea will negotiate in good faith. We don't have a common understanding about the nature of the regime, about its objectives and its strategy. And that's really the key difference. Now, the South Korean government, I don't think anybody will actually allow it to get to the point, the framework that you're talking about. I think they will talk about that. It's aspirational, but the South Korean people will not stand for something like that. And for the same reason that the younger generation of South Koreans actually oppose unification. And the reason is, as you stated, they are happy being, with their soft power, the economy that they have, 10th largest economy in the world, their democracy, their free market economy, their human rights, although this government challenges those in some areas. But I don't think that it's going to get to the point where that framework ever emerges, because politically the South Korean people will not stand for it. But you are correct in that the political parties, the progressive elements in South Korea, they are under delusions that they can somehow work with North Korea. Right. And, the other point just to make that really puts things in perspective, South Korea and the United States are willing to provide humanitarian assistance to the suffering Koreans in the North. Kim Jong-un refuses that. And it is the South Koreans and the Americans that have more concern for the welfare of the people in North Korea than does Kim Jong-un.
Yes.
And I think that's an important point to remember. And that's why South Korea, I don't think, will ever allow themselves to be duped by their own government into that kind of relationship that would put them at risk.
Well, again, I hope you're right about this. A lot is riding on it, and that's why we wanted very much to talk with you, is to get a sense of this. Because as you say, David, and I've been making this point repeatedly in the course of this series, that when you look at what the North Korean government does to its own people, it's unimaginable that it would be more sensitive to the treatment of its enemies, including us.
In 2014, the UN Commission of Inquiry, Justice Kirby from Australia, led the study, and it concluded that the human rights abuses in North Korea and the crimes against humanity are on a scale we haven't seen since World War II. Just imagine that. That is the amount of atrocities that are being committed.
And that's day in, day out. That's not in the midst of a global conflict.
This is over the last 70 years.
Right.
Think about this that people don't know very much about. At the end of the Korean War, and what caused the great delay in the armistice signing, it took almost 2 years to negotiate the armistice. It was about exchange of prisoners and how they were going to be returned. What people don't know is that at the end of the war, there were some 80,000 South Korean soldiers prisoner in North Korea who were never, ever returned. And there's been about 100 that have made it out, and we know the suffering that they've been under.
Sounds
but they've
kind
never
of like
been
our
returned.
situation in Vietnam, if you want to put a fine point on it.
Yes, it is, but even worse.
Much worse on a huge scale there. But David, we have to stop for a short break. We're going to come back more to discuss specifically this point you've made about delusions, specifically in the context of a peace treaty, and what that might actually do to make the Korean Peninsula once again not a center of peace, unfortunately, but a cockpit for perhaps a second Korean War. We're going to talk about that and much more with David Maxwell, a distinguished United States Special Forces colonel, now a senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's widely published, he's highly regarded, and I'm personally thrilled to be able to continue this conversation with him about one of the most significant challenges that is being least attended to, namely the prospect that that regime in North Korea under Kim Jong-un is deadly serious about violence in the future. That and more is coming up. Stay tuned.